Hello, I'm Michael Pierce, and this is The Human Condition. Today our topic is Hashimoto's and Graves' disease of the thyroid, and this has come about as viewer requests. We've gotten a ton of requests for this particular issue, and I just can't believe how much interest there is, and I'm happy to address it. Again, I am not an endocrinologist. My particular discipline is chiropractic neurology, but we see this so much in holistic living and American diets because Hashimoto's is one of the most common, if not the most common, autoimmune disease in humans. It's a hypothyroid condition usually, mostly, although we need to do a little unpacking of Hashimoto's. There is a Hashimoto's storm, which is a huge event where the immune system attacks vehemently your thyroid and it's a terrible thyroid storm, and that's not exactly the same thing. That's an event. But Hashimoto's thyroiditis is the kind of the boring status quo of having an autoimmune thyroid condition in between the storms. So when someone has Hashimoto's thyroid, they have an autoimmune disease. You may know that most people have understood thyroid disease as a thyroid deficiency, where the thyroid isn't adequately making enough thyroid hormone, and the person becomes lethargic and they gain weight and they have all kinds of symptoms of low metabolism. Low blood pressure, low pulse, low motivation. They don't talk as much, they move slower, they gain weight, they sleep too much, and they have all these symptoms that are classic hypothyroid symptoms. Well, the problem with this is that only 10% of people with a hypothyroid condition have the classic, iodine deficiency or simple type of hypothyroid without autoimmunity. 90% of people, Americans especially, that have a hypothyroid condition have the Hashimoto's autoimmune form. And yet in the United States, the treatment is the same. I think this is probably inadequate because the treatment is a thyroid hormone replacement. And certainly that's necessary once you qualify for the diagnosis, but is it sufficient? Is it sufficient? And I don't think so. Because when you give a thyroid hormone replacement, you are replacing the thyroid hormone that's missing, which is life-saving and necessary, but it's also not addressing the autoimmune attack. And so we have to figure out effective ways of dealing with the autoimmune attack. There is no medical way to do that right now except steroids. So right now, if you get really bad, they give you steroids to suppress your immune system. That's true for all autoimmune conditions generally. So we should also know that about 8 to 10% of Americans have a hypothyroid condition. And of course, 90% of those are Hashimoto's or the autoimmune kind. So what is happening? For some reason, the body decides to attack the thyroid tissue as though it were an infectious organism. So our immune systems are primed to have antigen-presenting cells, which are white blood cells that circle around the body, and they gather and collect antigens, which are basically the uniform or the clothing of an invading organism. So an invading organism has a uniform, it has an outer shell, it has a marker on its outside, and sometimes an antigen-presenting cell will capture an entire cell that is an invading organism, and sometimes it will capture a chunk of an invading cell that's been digested and broken apart. You may have heard of that with the coronavirus spike protein, which is a chunk of a virus that is on the surface. In any case, as the body gathers these chunks of proteins that identify an object as an invading organism, sometimes the immune system gets confused and it identifies a protein from food, like dairy or gluten or casein or corn or any number of things, and it says, aha, that protein fragment from food is actually an infectious organism. It's kind of like Mr. Magoo going, I can't really see you clearly, and it misidentifies you. And it's not comical in this case, it's really quite annoying and dangerous. Well, not only can you misidentify food as an invading organism, you can misidentify your own tissues, and that's called an autoimmune disease. Anytime your body attacks itself, it's called an autoimmune disease, and there's a million of them. You can attack your bone, you can attack your testes and ovaries, you can attack your kidneys, you can attack your cerebellum of your brain, but not the rest of your brain. You can attack the white matter of your brain, but not the gray matter of your brain. You can attack your thyroid. You can attack your small intestine, which is celiac disease. So there's all these different autoimmune diseases, which is a confusion of the immune system overreacting to a protein and saying, that's a foreign protein, it's not me, and I am going to attack it. So in Hashimoto's disease, the immune system decides that the proteins in and on the thyroid gland are foreign, dangerous, and are going to multiply and infect us. And that's just not true. But the body thinks it is. So when the body makes antibodies to attack the thyroid, and they start to attack the thyroid, they rip open the thyroid cells and destroy some of the thyroid cells. Every time you have a storm, which is an event where the autoimmune system really kicks in and starts to attack, antibodies attach to the thyroid and they signal other cells to come and destroy thyroid cells. And when that happens, thyroid cells have within them pre-made, ready-made thyroid hormone, thyroxine. And that gets released into the bloodstream. So all of a sudden, it's as if the thyroid suddenly went, here's a bunch of thyroid hormone for you. And so now you have all this excess thyroid hormone, T3 and T4 thyroid hormones circulating around your body. And what do? They signal your body to increase metabolism. So you get symptoms like hotness and high blood pressure and rapid pulse and can't sleep and losing weight and skin irritations and hyperactive brain, where you're almost like ADHD symptoms or hyperactivity symptoms, as we used to call them for kids. In some cases, we see hyperkinesis, which is kids that can't stop moving, or even adults that can't stop moving. You may have seen politicians or personalities on TV, and as they sit, they never ever sit still. They're always kind of moving and writhing. They don't quite have a movement disorder, but it's close. It looks like they have the beginnings of a choreiform movement disorder, but it's not quite that. But they just are always moving. They're always doing something. They never ever settle. In any case, when a person has the Hashimoto's attack, they eventually stop the storm. And when the storm stops, now there's no more attacking going on. And the thyroid has been damaged and it's inflamed and it's less efficient. So now the thyroid has the opposite problem. It doesn't secrete enough thyroid hormone. So now we have low thyroid. So when people have Hashimoto's, they have spans of time with low thyroid function and then spurts of high function when they're undergoing storms. This leads them to have alternating TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone does not come from the thyroid. It comes from the pituitary. So as the pituitary senses that there's thyroid levels that are high during a storm, the pituitary says, oh, I better tell the thyroid to stop working because it's releasing too much thyroid hormone. Well, did it really release too much thyroid hormone, or did it just release it because it was being destroyed and ripped open by antibodies? Well, that's actually the case. So then later on, when the thyroid is not being attacked and there's a less secretion of thyroid hormone into the bloodstream, then the pituitary senses this and the hypothalamus senses this and says, wait a minute, there's not enough hormone. I better goose the thyroid to make more hormone because it's not making hormone. Well, it's not making hormone because a number of its cells just got destroyed in the latest thyroid storm attack, and it's inflamed. So it doesn't produce as much thyroid hormone as it used to. So the pituitary and hypothalamus kick into gear and say, let's make TRH and TSH and secrete those and have that thyroid stimulating hormone tell that thyroid, get working. And so then the thyroid has to start working again and try to work harder. So you'll see that with people that have deficient thyroid, they have high TSH. And when people have adequate thyroid or over-adequate thyroid hormone production or thyroxine production, T3 and T4 usually, they will have a negative feedback that will make their pituitary reduce TSH secretion. So here's the rule of thumb. If you have a largely hypothyroid condition, most of the time you'll have low thyroid hormone and you'll have high TSH. So the diagnostic criteria for this is high TSH in the blood and often low thyroid hormones in the blood to diagnose a hypothyroid condition. It has to be above or below a certain laboratory range to qualify. If it's a little bit higher, a little bit low, but still normal, you don't qualify. And this is wise because you qualify for whether you're going to take a medicine or not. And you don't want to take artificial thyroid hormone without needing it. But if you don't have adequate thyroid hormone circulating in your blood, your organs will decay because all of our organs are made of protein. And protein is made and decays very rapidly. If you make protein and release it into the universe, protein decays at the rate of about a half-life of 7 to 14 days. That means half of the protein will be gone or decayed in 7 to 14 days if you leave it out on a sidewalk. Faster if it's in the sun, of course, but generally the idea is that protein degrades, protein falls apart, as all things do. And so we need a thyroid system to keep telling our bodies to turn on DNA and make new proteins and manufacture new proteins all the time. So once we have low thyroid hormone, we're not making those new proteins to replace the ones that decayed, because our organs are always falling apart and we're always rebuilding them all the time. And thyroid hormone is what does that. It's what triggers that. And so it triggers cells to do that so that you make this new protein. If you suddenly run out or slowly run out, which is what usually happens, you slowly run out of thyroid hormone and you get less than the normal range of what you need, you won't maintain your organs and your organs will start to atrophy and decay, literally. This means failure of heart valves. This means failure of the liver. This means brain failure. This means organ failure. This means kidney failure. This means the need for kidney dialysis. This is horrible. So we don't want to let a person that has abnormally lab high TSH, which means low thyroid function, go for very long without doing something. And this is a common mistake in natural medicine, is holistic doctors and holistic people will sometimes look at a high TSH that's above the lab range and say, well, let's treat this naturally. And that's okay, but if you don't keep your eye on it every 30 days and redo the blood tests, this person could really, really get into a pickle where their organs start to fail, and it would be your fault. So we don't want to do that. That's a bad idea. So whether you're alternative or not, you really want to medically intervene. Just like if somebody showed up at your front door and they were bleeding, a friend of yours showed up at your front door and they were bleeding, you wouldn't say, oh, let's put some arnica on that and see if it stops. You get them to a doctor where they can, put a bandage on it, stitch it up, and properly take care of it. You wouldn't just let them, try to figure it out. Now, sometimes the wound is small enough that you can heal it without the stitches. Sometimes the thyroid is not bad enough that you can fix it with natural methods, and I'm a fan of that. But I'm also a fan of responsible measurement to make sure that you're actually measuring the TSH to make sure that you're effective. Because if you're not effective, the TSH will remain high. So now we have to talk about what is the difference between Hashimoto and regular thyroid. If 10% of people with a thyroid problem have low thyroid because of essentially an iodine deficiency or a protein deficiency that makes them just make not enough thyroid hormone, then we want to figure out why that is. There could be other endocrine reasons, pituitary and brain reasons, other types of problems that are not discussed for this topic today. But generally, the person that has that problem is only 10% of the thyroid patients. 90% of the thyroid patients, which is 8 to 10% of the United States, has this problem where they have an autoimmune Hashimoto's thyroid disease, where their thyroid is being attacked. So the diagnostic criteria for that is a person needs to have high TSH, above or below the normal range, and they also have to have an antibody positive to the thyroid gland. Now, there are two antibodies to choose from. You only need one, but we like to check for both. The most common one is the TPO antibody. It's the thyroid peroxidase enzyme in your thyroid, and your body produces an antibody that attacks and destroys the thyroid peroxidase. It's an enzyme that makes material for you and substances for you. Then there's also thyroglobulin. Thyroglobulin is a binding protein that holds onto thyroid hormone and allows it to be gripped while your body adds iodine and removes iodine from the molecule, so that you go from T4 to T3 and T2 and T1 as you add and remove iodines to these molecules. You have to grip it somehow. And the thing that grips the molecule is the thyroglobulin. So thyroglobulin is another protein inside your thyroid gland that your body attacks and says, you're a foreign invader, you are a bacteria that's going to kill me. And so we look for either elevated thyroglobulin antibodies, or we look for TPO antibodies. And an out-of-range TSH. Usually high, but can be low, abnormal. That one or the other of those antibodies and out-of-range TSH is the criteria for a thyroid diagnosis that requires some kind of treatment. This can be pursued naturally and in many cases can be reversed, but again, you don't want to go off half-cocked and not look at the blood work and endanger someone's life by not giving them appropriate medication at the time. It is debatable whether a thyroid is thoroughly damaged and cannot come back, and the only way to figure that out is to test it. So if you really want to know if a thyroid is recoverable, that has been on thyroid replacement, The only way to do it is to try things and test the levels and see if they come back. Just like with insulin and diabetes. We're learning today that type 2 diabetes can be reversed. Some people might argue that thyroid is an autoimmune disease and that autoimmune diseases destroy the organ in question. And that is true. However, you never know how much thyroid is left. People don't need very much thyroid. We have way more thyroid gland than we need when we grow up and become adults. So if you had even a couple decades of autoimmune thyroid disease where your immune system was attacking your thyroid and you lost maybe 50% of the thyroid cells, you may still have more than enough thyroid cells to make thyroid adequately for the rest of your life. But you'd have to really, really measure it to make sure that your lifestyle ideas were borne out by science and not just some pipe dream of yours. So that is the diagnostic criteria for Hashimoto's. There is another disease that comes up, and it's called Graves' disease. Graves' disease is much more rare, and it's much more serious, and it usually manifests as very strange thyroid-like disorders, and when it gets worse, it becomes a mental illness. The person can act very crazy. They can start to do weird things and feel weird things and say weird things, and people observing them say, "Man, your behavior is so erratic." And those people usually have an antibody, which is called the Graves antibody, where it's an antibody to the TSH receptor. So the TSH receptor is the receptor on your thyroid gland that receives TSH and says, "Oh, I get you, pituitary. I'm supposed to make more thyroid hormone." And when the immune system attacks that receptor that is supposed to receive the TSH, then all hell breaks loose, and the person starts to release and manufacture so much thyroid hormone that their TSH is suppressed and it's very, very low. So the blood test of a Graves' disease person will include two things. It'll include a high TSH receptor antibody or other antibodies, including very often TPO, by the way. TPO goes with Hashimoto's, but it's not required. It's not required, but it is often high in Graves too. TPO is not diagnostic for Graves, though, by itself. So we look for the TSH receptor antibody and maybe TPO antibodies, and we look for a super, super low TSH, a super low thyroid stimulating hormone that comes from the pituitary circulating in the blood. That is going to be like 0.01 on a blood test. Super, super low. And you're going to look at it and go, I don't see that very often. And that's another hallmark of Graves' disease. I've caught several of these in my career, and it's very important. They need to see an endocrinologist. There is no medical treatment for Graves' disease. Many of them have been able to compensate for it with a combination of their endocrinologist and holistic work. But you must get fast treatment for Graves' disease because it is much more dangerous than Hashimoto's, although Hashimoto's is a pretty big deal, especially when it's in a storm phase. So that's the Hashimoto's diagnostic criteria, the Graves' diagnostic criteria. And of course, there are iodine tests that can be done in urine and blood for iodine levels. This lecture is not about that, but that is also useful and necessary to look at. So the last part about Hashimoto's and Graves is that Hashimoto's is not Graves, but they do come together sometimes. A person can have Hashimoto's, they can have Graves alone, or they can have Hashimoto's and Graves, which is a whole multifactorial autoimmune attack. And once a person gets one autoimmune disease, if they don't address the autoimmune imbalance in their body, they tend over time to develop more autoimmune diseases, like MS, for example. So it's really important that if you've already got MS, to look for other autoimmune diseases throughout your life to make sure that you don't develop them. Any autoimmune disease begets searching and looking for the rest of your life diligently for other autoimmune diseases to just make sure that you don't suddenly or slowly, insidiously come down with another autoimmune disease. If you have an autoimmune disease or multiple autoimmune diseases, life can be good for you sometimes. It's not always, but most of the time there are dietary ways of reducing that. Those are things like reducing gluten and dairy. Extremely important because the molecule is the thyroid marker. These markers that our immune system attacks look very much chemically, the proteins and sugars look very much like dairy molecules, like casein molecules, and like gluten molecules and gliadin molecules, and all these molecules that are in gluten and dairy. So it's extremely important to reduce gluten and dairy for most people that have a thyroid disease. And we also find that for Graves' disease too. And usually to avoid almost all grains anyway and keep a low-carb diet and regulate their blood sugar flares. They really want to reduce inflammation, and they want to make sure that they have adequate fats, omega-3s and omega-6s, and they want to make sure that they have enough minerals, full spectrum minerals. A person that has Hashimoto's and Graves, there is a statistical significance of people with Hashimoto's often have more lactose intolerance as well. Now, lactose is a sugar. I was talking about dairy protein, which is casein, and that's more of the autoimmune attack. But it's true that Hashimoto's patients have a higher propensity for lactose intolerance too. I don't know if it's the reverse. I haven't seen the literature. I don't know if people with lactose intolerance have a higher rate of Hashimoto's, but people with Hashimoto's do have a higher incidence of lactose intolerance too. So avoid gluten and dairy, avoid grains, carefully monitor your insulin resistance. Do that through measuring, insulin, C-peptide, C-reactive protein, look at glucose tolerance tests, look at fasting insulin. These are all useful and wonderful tests. GGT is a very useful test for looking at your cholesterol effects on your blood sugar and your tolerance of carbs. GGT is an emerging marker for that. So these are useful tips that I hope will help you. And I'd like to give you hope that isn't false hope while I educate and say that, you really got to take thyroid hormone in some cases, even if you're holistic, but and seek expert help if you have Graves' disease, because the natural route may not be enough. But it doesn't mean that you can't use the natural route too. So you might find that you suddenly are diagnosed with a thyroid condition and you've got to take thyroid hormone for the rest of your life, but you might be able to reduce the dose and you might be able to control your flares for the rest of your life and prevent other onsets of other autoimmune diseases. And in some cases, you might be able to reverse the disease.